Welcome to the Money Over 50 podcast, brought to you by Dallas Davison and Michael Hogue from Money Over 50 Financial Advisors. This information is general in nature and does not take into account your objectives, financial situation, or needs. Therefore, you should consider whether the information is appropriate for you and your personal circumstances. If you require personal advice, please contact Money Over 50 Financial Advisors. Here are your hosts, Dallas Davison and Michael Hogue.
Welcome to Money Over 50 with Dallas and Michael. Today's topic, why you probably need 1.1 cars in your retirement. Dallas.
Thanks, Michael.
I got to say I like it.
Just
not
title.
1.5 cars, not two cars, not one car, 1.1 cars.
Where I thought of this, you know the old saying of, the standard family in Australia is mum and dad and 2.2 kids, is what they always talked about, where it's like...
It was 2.3.
2.3,
When I was growing up, there was a brilliant ad, and it was 3 kids in the back of a car and 2 bigger brothers on either side, and there was, in the middle, there was a tiny little kid. And he said, there's 2.3 kids in the average Australian family, and I'm the 0.3.
Yeah, exactly.
And he was sitting, and it was all about how I think it was the Commodore at the time, had a bigger space in the back to fit 2.3 kids. And the whole point of it was you never find 2.3 kids. You have 2 or you have 3, and his family was 3 kids. So
and that's so where I got thinking about this is it's actually the 1.1 car thing came from. In my own life, I had a mate who's a long-time listener of the podcast, Andrew from the UK, who's when he moved over to Townsville and stayed with us for a few months, and he was living with us, and he's actually working out of our office and using that for his for a bit of his IT business. But we worked out that I had 1 car, and most of the time we only needed 1 car sort of between us, but sometimes, very rarely, we would both need to go somewhere different at the same time. And so we basically worked out we needed 1.1 cars. It would have been a complete waste for us to have 2 cars, for him to have his own car while he was staying with me for a couple of months and while we were doing so many trips together. So, and I think that's the position most people find themselves in approaching retirement, is that while you're both working, leading up to retirement, you sort of need 2 cars. Everyone needs basically 2 cars. And then you hit retirement, and people know that they probably don't need 2 cars, but you can think of situations where you do need 2 cars very occasionally. So invariably what happens is either you end up with 1 car, and every time you get stuck, it becomes a real burden. It feels like a real imposition that, maybe we need 2 cars. But if you do have 2 cars, 99.9% of the time, one of them's sitting in the driveway, and there's only one of the cars being used at any one time. So what I worked out with this is that if you have 2 cars, you'll always use the 2 cars. So what I'd propose to people to do in the first year of your retirement is, if you think that you think you don't need 2 cars anymore, but 1 car might not be enough, here's what you do. You sell your car, you sell one of the cars for whatever amount of money that you get, and you take some of that cash and you put it in a separate bank account. And what you do is you link that bank account to an Uber account, and then what you do is you just go about your normal life for that first year of your retirement with 1 car, and every time you both need to use the car, you just get an Uber, but this is the key, you use the Uber completely guilt-free. You don't think about, it cost me $20 to get the Uber from here to there or anything like that. Just use the Uber, go and live your normal life as you normally would, but get an Uber occasionally when you do both need a car. Then at the end of that year, what you do is you calculate, right, how much money do I start the year with in that Uber account? How much have I used in Uber expenses for that year? And that actually tells you exactly how much extra car you need. So for some people, you might get to the end of the year and go, I only took one $20 trip in that account, and so I've only spent $20. Geez, I know then it's very easy to see that I probably, there's no point us in car because we don't use it at all. Now, there will be a crossover period where if over the course of that year you've spent $50 on Ubers every week, and you get to the end of the year and you've spent $2,500 out of that account, then you may look at purchasing another car. But what you really want to do then, and it becomes very concrete, is the tangible nature of that's what the extra 0.1 of a car cost you in that year if you had to pay that to Uber versus the extra cost to run that extra car in retirement. And you've done some numbers on what that actually costs you.
Look, these are rough figures at best, but I've just put down, I put down for tyres and maintenance on a vehicle, $1,000 a year.
Yep, that's exactly
could be over, could be under.
Yep.
$1,000 a year for registration, could be over, could be under.
Yep.
And $1,000 a year for insurance. And again, it could be over or could be under. If you look at all those three things, tyres and maintenance is one, rego is another, and insurance is another.
Yep.
I'm going to say they'll all come to, on average, about $3,000 a year.
Yep.
And that includes servicing as well, so maintenance servicing.
Yep.
So I'm going to then say that depreciation runs at about $5,000 a year. And what I'm talking about there, people will buy a $50,000 car and they'll sell it 5 years later for $25,000.
Yeah.
And what's happened over that 5 year period, it's depreciated by $5,000 a year. They've bought it for $50,000, they've sold it for $25,000.
Yeah.
Now, whether that's less or more than $5,000 depends on a number of different factors.
Yeah.
But let's just say it's around that ballpark.
Yeah.
So it's $8,000 a year to run a vehicle.
Yeah.
So if we look at an average wage for a comfortable retirement for our clients that have recently retired, it's about $80,000 a year, $80,000 a year. Some years they spend more. And again, we've gone into the detail before. They're not paying tax. They're not paying off a home loan. They're not raising a family, all that sort of stuff. About $80,000 a year gives them a good lifestyle. Now, if you're paying $8,000 a year for each vehicle, it's a good place to shave that
it's an easy
living cost because if you think of it in terms of it represents 10% of your annual living expenses.
Yep.
So if you could run one vehicle in retirement and not run two, you've got an extra $8,000 effectively to put towards something. Travel, anything that you want to do in retirement. So it's a really, really good area to shave. I believe in terms of, and what I'm talking about that is if you can shave down to one car, and still live a pretty good lifestyle. And with both people retired, you generally can. You're not both heading in different directions to go to work. You might need the car. You might both need it at the same time. But like your point is, Dallas, you've got an account over here now with funds in there, and you get a taxi or an Uber.
Yes, and that's actually that's the way that I think about it. But I think of it a little bit differently, which is that basically the $3,000 a year is your running cost. It doesn't matter whether you drive a busted old Camry or whether you drive a new car that you bought for $60,000. You can't really get away with $3,000 of running costs. That's non-negotiable. So the depreciation of if you have as your second car a really old, really cheap little car, that depreciation figure might be less than $5,000, but it's still a real cost. And that's the second part of it is if you assume that the running cost of $3,000, that's going to happen either way. The depreciation, if you're happy to have as your second car a smaller, cheaper car, you can then sit down and that's a decision for you to make then as to what is the actual depreciation cost for you based on the car that you're thinking about keeping. But you do have to take that into account. And that's sort of why I like to look at it this other way, is that if at the end of the year you've spent less than $3,000 on Ubers, you can't possibly be financially better off with two cars. You might, separate to that, you might just want two cars or whatever, but financially, even though every week you've spent $50, $60 on Ubers and it feels painful to watch that coming out of your bank account, you really got to remember that that's $3,000. It was going to go anyway. It was going. It's just that it was going on insurance, maintenance, and that kind of thing, rather than going to Uber. So that's why part two of that strategy is if you get to the end of the year and you go, well, I spent $3,000 on Ubers, but that would have been just the basic running costs of my car, and that's without taking into account if I go and pull $20,000 out of my retirement savings and buy a car, what's the depreciation going to be on that car over the next 10 years, and what's the cost of that every year? You know that you're better off just running one car and using the 0.1 of Ubers or taxis or that kind of thing. The second part of it then is the emotional side of it. Is you really have to, and one of the strategies I've seen work is think of that as just the money that you're saving on those running costs. Don't think of it as a $3,000 expense on cabs and Ubers. Think of it as, I've got $3,000 in that account, and what I've actually heard of people do is put $3,000 a year into that account to run those Ubers. And so that when every time you go to go somewhere and you think, oh, I don't really want to go there because I'd have to get a cab, you think, no, that money's already been allocated for. That's just the savings on the running costs on that car. And then by doing that, you effectively get for free all the depreciation. What that was going to cost you in depreciation on that second car, you don't incur any of that cost, but you've already allocated all of the expenses of what you've needed to. And if you get to the end of that year and you've spent $5,000 on Ubers and you go, well, maybe I can run some little tiny cheap car that's only going to cost me $1,000 in depreciation, maybe I'm slightly better off having that, then by all means go and do it. But what we find invariably is that if you are able to cut back to one car from two cars, you never look back. You don't then think about it and worry about it. It's more of a burden in our imagination than what it is in reality. And for most people, like you said, Michael, it's a big place to be able to cut those, to shave a significant percentage of your income needs every year is to run back to one car.
Yeah, look, and especially, if we started with the assumption that $80,000 was going to be a really comfortable retirement, but for, whatever reason, you've worked out that you can sustainably draw only $75,000 from your retirement savings, then it's a low-hanging piece of fruit here to be able to look at and say, okay, well we could do without a second vehicle in this situation. So,
and that's exactly I guess the point there is, if you think of it as we were going to spend $80,000 each year, if we allow for $3,000 of running costs and $5,000 of depreciation, we were going to run two cars. It was going to cost, of our $80,000, $8,000 was going to be going out in that. You go, okay, well, we're still going to have the running cost of the $3,000. That pays for all the Ubers, all the cabs for the year. The $5,000, that depreciation, that's free. That's free money, and that's what gets us back to the $75,000. We don't have to make any other changes to our lifestyle. That's the adjustment that's picked up the difference there, and you're the same boat that you need to be. So that's, I guess, the way. There's something psychologically that goes on, I think, with all of these expenses, like paying for Ubers and paying for cabs. It seems like dead money. It's like the renting thing where you go, it feels like dead money to have to pay a cab to take you somewhere once a week or once a fortnight. But when you actually sit down and do the numbers on what does it actually cost you to have that second car that sits in your driveway 99.9% of the time, you're probably better off just running one car, and the 0.1 can come from Uber or from cabs.
Yeah. Good place to wrap up. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for listening to the Money Over 50 podcast with Money Over 50 Financial Advisors. We look forward to catching up again soon.